Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome back to the diDNA Dialogue, where we're going to be sharing something about the digital advertising industry that's going to impact you, the publisher. Today, I'm really excited to share that we have Scott Trench, the CEO of BiggerPockets, a brilliant real estate community that I'm actually very familiar with, today with us on the show. Scott, to kick us off, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm 30 years old, getting married here very shortly in the end of November. Not sure when this is going to release. You probably already mentioned it to me, but it's coming up soon. So very exciting time for me. I am the CEO of BiggerPockets.com. I'm a real estate investor. I have my real estate agent's license, but I do not use that to sell properties for other people. I just use that to kind of get my own deals there. I've got a book, and I'm just a huge personal finance nerd. My career goal, I would say, is to help as many people achieve financial freedom, which is this concept of having enough passive income to more than cover your lifestyle expenses as early in life as possible. Because when you do that, you free up high potential people to go out and make a big impact on society and start businesses, nonprofits, run for office, all that kind of good stuff. We trick you into thinking that you'll retire early and sip margaritas on the beach. And people do that for about 3 months and they get bored and go back to work. And so really excited about that. It's my passion. Love talking about it all day long.
That's awesome, right? It's almost you hunt down the financial freedom to have the free time and then actually end up doing a whole bunch of other stuff.
That's right. Yeah. Because just you're in command. You're in command at that point of your time and your money.
Right. Well, so we are planning to launch this probably in like a month and a half. So I'll make sure to tag you and say congratulations to both you and your wife.
Oh,
So
thank
congrats
you.
on
Yeah.
that. That's awesome. I think before even diving into a little more about BiggerPockets, I'd actually love to hear how you ended up at BiggerPockets, because you're talking about financial freedom. You're talking about being a real estate investor now, but to go from, and I did a little research, but operations all the way up to CEO. I'd love to know how you ended up in the spot that you are.
Yes, I started my career at a Fortune 500 company as a financial analyst, and quickly realized that I didn't want to climb the corporate ladder of going from financial analyst 1 to financial analyst 2 to senior financial analyst to finance manager to senior finance manager to director of finance to senior director of finance to VP of finance to senior VP of finance to CFO over a 20-year period. That was not the career or life that I wanted. And so I began to get really infatuated with this concept of financial freedom, which I just mentioned, and became kind of obsessing over it, frankly.
Right.
I began to spend as little as I possibly could so I could save up as much money as possible. And I wanted to figure out a way to reduce my lifestyle expenses to the lowest possible amount and just get to the bare minimum amount of income to cover them and then begin scaling from there. I saw it as the stepping stone was to live like almost a really tight lifestyle with very few expenses.
Yeah.
And the biggest, most important part of my expenses at the time was my housing. Housing is, for most people, their largest single expense. And my rent at about $650, I shared an apartment with a roommate, was my biggest expense. So I was like, how do I eliminate that? Well, I found this real estate website called BiggerPockets.com in podcast, and they gave me the idea of house hacking, the idea of buying a duplex, moving into half of it, and then having your tenants pay down your mortgage. Or you can do this with a triplex or quadplex or just a house with extra bedrooms. They all work. And I was like, that's it. Boom. By house hack, I'm basically done
Right.
for the most part, because, then the rest of my life only costs like $1,000 or $1,500 outside of housing. That's not a very large amount of money to have to cover on a monthly basis. So I did that and joined BiggerPockets at the end of 2014 as the third employee, a little startup online real estate community. And I just worked alongside the founder for a long time. Director of operations was my title. And if you're the director of operations at a 3-person company, it means you do all of the stuff that the founder doesn't like to do
12
or
different.
want to do. Yeah. Or the other guy, the other guy was a guy named Brandon Turner, who is a big face of our brand and host of our podcast and all that kind of good stuff. And so over the years, that included taking on more and more responsibilities, including finance, customer support, managing all revenue, managing all operations, managing all personnel. Ultimately, the founder decided to take a back seat to the business and asked me to take over as president of the organization. And as president, I led the organization through a recapitalization where we brought on private equity sponsors. We've got great partners, McCarthy Capital out of Omaha, Nebraska. And we concluded that in 2018. And for some reason, I'm still allowed to be in this seat as CEO and president and running the operation. I guess until we have a couple bad quarters. So thrilled to be here and lucky and count my lucky stars for joining um, the organization when I did, and just trying to play the hand I've been dealt as well as I can.
Right. I mean, still being in that seat means you've done a really good job so far, I would assume.
We'll see. Yeah.
Well, so again, before jumping into the bigger pockets part, really interested in the way that you got there. So it seems like just personal passion in terms of financial freedom. So a lot of the FIRE movement that I think a lot of people talk about
That's
is
right.
that kind of where you ended up, and you just saw bigger pockets as another way to kind of share that with everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. The fire was the motivating force for me, and fire financial independence, retire early is, I think, in and of itself almost like a selfish desire at first for most people, and I think that's perfectly okay. I think
Yeah.
it's wonderful. I was not motivated to change the world for the better when I got started with my financial journey. I was motivated by the fact that like I didn't want to be at the beck and call and whim of my manager, who is another cog in the machine at this Fortune 500 company, who,
Right.
herself was 6 layers removed from the CEO and had very little power. I didn't want that for myself.
Right.
So fire was the goal, not real estate. Real estate is one tool in the arsenal for those moving towards fire. It happens to be a very good tool for a
Right.
large chunk of the population because it offers cash flow, um, the chance for significantly better returns than, say, the stock market, and allows one to do high dollar per hour activities. For example, fixing a toilet at your rental property um, is probably going to take you 2 hours and a trip to Home Depot and $50. Well, if it costs you $300 or $400 to call the plumber, that's a $200 an hour activity.
Right.
So real estate investing offers people the opportunity to do that and to generate on top of that those returns in the 15, 20, 25% range or even higher, depending on how you're capitalizing and finding deals and those types of things. So again, the real estate I just decided was the right tool for me in my circumstance in life. Someone who's very busy or who earns a very high dollar per hour salary, real estate's perhaps not going to be such a good tool for them. Someone who earns very little is going to have a lot of difficulty financing real estate. So it just depends. There's
Yeah.
tons of good tools out there.
I appreciate the transparency there too, because I think the start for looking for that retiring early or the financial freedom starts at a selfish piece. You want to buy your own free time, and it starts with those kinds of investments. But at the end of the day, it's once you kind of get tied to a community like Bigger Pockets, you want to share with everybody else. It's really easy, and
Yeah.
easy might be a loose term there, but simple if it's done the right way.
Once you get it, you're just like, why is everyone not doing this? Why,
Right.
like, what is going on? Like, how are you not moving toward financial freedom? I
Yeah.
don't understand.
Right.
And so but of course they don't understand you, and that's where you look for that community online, which brings us to like the fire movement and the communities around that. Bigger Pockets, our real estate investing community, our Bigger Pockets money and personal finance community, and those types of things.
Right. Which perfect segue into Bigger Pockets. So I joined 5 years ago. And it has evolved so much, almost even to some of the publishing house you guys have too. But I'd love to hear a little more about Bigger Pockets and kind of share that with everybody.
Yeah. So, what is Bigger Pockets? Bigger Pockets is first and foremost a community. And around that community, so let's start with our forums. We've got 1.8 million people who have joined our community over the past 16 years.
Mhm.
And some of those members come in, never do another thing again. Some of those members come in and post a handful of times in our forums and engage moderately, mostly lurk. And some of those users go on to post hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of times across our community, help lots of people in those types of things. We have this power curve of community activism, you would say, where you've got the lurkers who are doing basically nothing or hitting the site once, and then you've got folks that are really actively involved.
Right.
That gives us a really powerful competitive advantage because those power users and the folks that are really long-term meaningful contributors to our platform are folks that have done dozens of deals, that really know their stuff, that just love talking about it, love helping other people, genuinely good characters. We get to meet them and interact with them over time. And then we invite them to come and blog for us, and write for our blog. We know we're getting self-made, multimillionaire, altruistic, charismatic, and articulate writers for our
Right.
blog. We know we're getting, we can invite them to come on our podcast and share their stories and successes, often
Right.
journeys we've watched over years within the community. We can invite them to write books for us. So one of my favorite examples is we've got a fellow named Jay Scott within our community. Jay Scott joined the community 14 years ago, completed over 150 flicks and flip projects, posted 17,000 times to our community cumulatively, still does today, has written 4 books for us, and now hosts one of our podcasts. And so what you get on BiggerPockets is that feedback from the community that's, and Jay, there might be a discussion about how best to flip a house.
Right.
And you might have 3 guys like Jay who all disagree with one another about the nuances of that and are respectfully going at each other's throats in a very productive way about, they would never do it that way, but about the right way to do that. And that's where learning takes place, I think, is when you say, hey, the best way to make money in real estate is by buying really cheap properties with great rent to price ratios in Detroit, Michigan.
Right.
And another guy's like, no, the best way to make money in real estate is to buy low cash flowing but high appreciation potential properties in Denver, Colorado. And they're both making money and both have very sophisticated, low risk, long-term approaches to real estate investing. That debate and conflict, I think, is what is really valuable about what we do, and why I'm so passionate about it.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. So, and then you said that there's the forum piece, but the forum has evolved into what other main items for BiggerPockets? Like you're saying, is it more of a community that's become, other than just looking for advice?
Yeah. So look, and this was not articulated at the beginning and the outset from a playbook perspective. But if we have kind of like a formula almost for creating value for our users in these different areas. So for example, we've created a real estate rookie podcast recently. Right? Why do we create a real estate rookie podcast? Well, we realized that the real estate podcast for BiggerPockets is too broad in a lot of ways for folks. It's very valuable, and then secondarily, when people listen to hundreds of episodes of that podcast, the 450th episode where they're hearing what is cash flow defined again, that's a poor user experience. But I can create a second market here that has just the content that is always reiterating, here's what a cap rate is, here's what cash flow is, here's what these numbers are, here's what the real struggles of people who are not perfect and have done this for 10 years, but are going through their first deal. Everyone makes tons of mistakes in their first deal,
Right.
figuring that out. Great. You launch a podcast there. You build a Facebook group around that, and you make sure that the show interacts with that Facebook group. You build that online community on the BiggerPockets web platform as well, so that they can interact on our forums in that capacity. You layer in a YouTube videos and those types of things that surround that content. The authors over time begin to develop credibility in the space and really get to know the problems of their users, not just because they're interacting perpetually within the community, but also because they're having a forced interview about user problems every week live on the podcast, where they're thinking through it, not just from that user, but all the other problems all the questions that they need to ask to give the most value to the other listeners. And so they become very credible. And then there's a book that they can write that becomes a chance at it being a bestseller because of their credibility, and has a very high chance of being a very high quality book as well because of their, the amount of expertise that they're developing. Then, you can layer in other things like live events around that. And so what is BiggerPockets? Right now, BiggerPockets is a community around real estate investing broadly that really brings all that together between digital experience with podcasts, online and social media community, and then the physical in the form of, literal books, literal local meetups that are occurring all around the country. And then of course, our big conferences that we officially endorse and sponsor.
Right. It sounds like you take that broad community and you get extremely granular with it, which is really cool to hear about the podcast. And actually, I remember listening originally to the BiggerPockets podcast, and just that was our option that we had as users and listeners in the real estate investing piece. And now you have the rookie podcast, which is a good example. So actually listening to your users that are on the base and kind of expanding out into different verticals, has that driven the strategy for, let's say, user acquisition on the site?
Yeah. So, when I think about our business, I carve it out into like three or four revenue buckets, right? One is this kind of concept of what is really more of a traditional media business, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that's our podcasts, our videos. Those are monetized through advertising. Okay. So let's take a podcast like this, for example. For us, we sell advertising on our podcasts, and that advertising costs $25 per thousand downloads, more give or take. It's just the pricing depends on various things, and the recency of the show, all those types of things. Let's call it $25 per thousand impressions, and in an hour-long episode, there will be 5 advertisements. Okay, so that means that I'm making $125 per thousand downloads.
Right.
Right. If we reach, and let's be conservative here. Let's say we sell out 70% of the ads. Okay, so look, if I've got an episode that serves 10,000 people, then I'm going to make $1,250.
Right.
I'm going to allow a vacancy allowance, unsold advertising allowance. I'm going to I got to pay the hosts of the show something. I've got to pay to produce and edit and, write the descriptions and all those types of things to produce that show. And we've got to allocate overhead. My time is worth something, as is the time of the rest of our staff and the office space and those types of things that go into all supporting that show. So at the end of the day, I've determined that if I get to about 10,000 listens per episode in a podcast, that I will more or less break even on that show. Life is not all about money, but you can't scale production indefinitely if you're losing money, right?
100%.
So you got to be at least break even for it to be valuable. And that's the great thing about capitalism in general, right? I'm not sitting here saying like, oh, it's all about money. No, my show is not making money if we're not getting enough listens and it's not valuable enough to enough people, right? And so you can kind of do the same thing for a YouTube video, right? There's ads on the YouTube video and those types of things. And then so each one of these pieces of content in general needs to have what's called positive unit economics, right? The unit economics have to be favorable to allow us to continue scaling production. And where that's the case, the reason that's the case is because people are loving the content and consuming it at a high enough level, or the right people are consuming that content. You don't need 10,000 listeners to a podcast on multifamily syndication. You
Right.
only need 100 listeners for that one, and those people are each incredibly valuable, for example, to a sponsor for those types of things, right?
Yeah.
So you can build those niche communities. You just have to really know what your users are worth economically in order to scale a business, right? On those things. And so the idea is like, great, you layer those things up and you say, all these things are related. They're all one and the same. A podcast listener drives, then goes on to potentially join our online community, then goes on to join the YouTube community. The more ways we can give them content and value, the better off they are, and the more they go on to potentially contribute to the community. And each piece of the content then is contributing to other things, lowering my threshold.
Right.
So for example, if that's break even on in isolation for the podcast, I know that I'm getting potential other benefits like driving acquisition to our YouTube channel,
Right.
and ultimately onto our site, and perhaps some of those users go on to buy our pro membership or books as well. So really getting tight on those things I think is key. And then so our model is, hey, we got this media business, we've got this subscription business, and we've also got what we call this lead generation business, where a lot of our users really need lenders, agents,
Yeah.
insurance brokers, and property managers and those types of things. And one of our goals is to build out this directory of really good investor-friendly real estate agents, investor-friendly lenders, property managers, and have them rated by the community, given feedback and those types of things, and allow our users to go there. So what is our business model? Our business is a media business, a subscription business, and this lead generation business, but all tied around this concept of building community, one community and market niche and real estate at a time,
Yeah.
that our users demand and desire.
Right. And you got to start with the community too, which is really cool to hear some of the strategy of creating that lead generation. And it's not just for, a lot of times I hear lead generation on real estate, and I think a lender or a realtor, and it's just looking for the end user trying to buy a home. But it sounds like you're expanding it much further than that, which is really cool to hear. Do you think that is going to tie into, let's say, ad strategy for 2021? Because I'm thinking a lot of people are familiar with display and video. But as you already addressed, there's audio that you guys are performing. There's connected TV. There's a lot of other options in terms of advertising. But do you think there's going to be some kind of direct correlation to like a direct sale with some of these lenders or these investors tied back to that media business, or is it going to be completely separate
Are
verticals?
you asking about us acquiring new users or us selling our inventory as the publisher of advertising space?
So you selling your inventory as the publisher.
Yeah. So look, the way right now we have a pretty simplistic model, right? Let's take our podcast for example, right?
Right.
So our podcast gets a certain amount of downloads, and we typically sell those downloads to a national buyer of that inventory.
Right.
We have the ability to so look, let's say that our CPM there is $25
Right.
per thousand impressions, right? Well, we could geo target that and say, hey, these are like 3 or 4 really good agents in Los Angeles.
Right.
Agent, would any of you guys like to sponsor the show and just reach the listeners in Los Angeles specifically? For us to do that economically, we'll have to charge a much higher CPM than $25 because it's much easier to just sell all the inventory in bulk to a national buyer and to
Right.
sell it chunk by chunk. But you imagine that that's very valuable to that agent.
Yeah.
And you could drive that CPM to 100 or 200 or even $1,000 per thousand listeners, potentially
Yeah.
in those types of areas to make that economical. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you're so the traditional way that we look at a direct sale is kind of like what you're saying in terms of bulk. So a lot of our publishers that we work with will take all the inventory that they have on the site, go out and let's say strike up a deal with Nike versus the sponsorship deals that you're saying. But you have both in the advertising pie, if so to speak, right? You have the large ones in bulk, but then just a higher CPM amount for these smaller realtors or lenders for the same amount of inventory and impressions.
Absolutely. And we've tried to be very careful not to um, really get into bed with any advertisers and those types of things because we feel that our goal is like we're happy to allow advertisers to sponsor our episodes and those types of things, and we typically believe that the ones that are sponsoring are reputable good companies. We don't guarantee that. We've found a few in the past that we've had to cut relationships with and those types of things, but that's pretty rare. But what I think is really important is to make sure that if we're ever going to endorse somebody in the way that, like in a really big partnership capacity, we have to be really sure that they're the actual best solution for our users
Yeah.
and that they're going to remain the best solution for some time. Because the moment that we're pushing our audience to one product or another, and it's not the right one on the market, is the moment I think we begin to, destroy our brand, frankly.
Yeah. In the bigger pockets brand, from my point of view, does put the user up on a pedestal, right? I think the user experience and what you're coming to the site for, you guys put that at the very top of the list in terms of priority. And correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I remember being a user before I worked here and being like, good God, this is like a religion and a new way of looking at life. And like, I'm going to completely go in and go after this. And I love Bigger Pockets and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to be successful. I'm going to do almost whatever Bigger Pockets says to do to be
Yeah.
successful. And like, if we abuse that, that's the end of our business. So I think that that's a big key for that and to kind of line in the sand there.
Right. So trying to balance the user experience and the right amount of ad revenue for some of our publishers has always been a challenge. And I think you guys are striking up a really solid, I think, balance, right? There's the subscription model, and I've got plenty of publishers that fall into that bucket. There's a paywall, you log in, you're not going to see ads. So how did you and the BP team really figure out, I think, the right amount of balance? Did you just go straight over to podcasts? It was going to be audio advertisements and any kind of direct sales, and then keep the forums completely clean because we're focusing on the user experience? Or was it a completely different strategy? Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe I'll take your question and reframe it. Let me know if this is
Yeah.
what you're asking. But how do, just like generally speaking, how do we find the right balance of how much advertising to serve in general across the user experience?
Yeah, I think on the forums versus podcast audio and keeping the forums clean, again, with the user being the priority.
All right. So first of all, the forums look a little clean today because we got rid of those, frankly, maybe I get in trouble to say this, horrible Google display ads that you show up. But we had those for years and years and years and years and years, and we only killed them like last year, I think.
Right.
So how do we keep the forums clean? We just decided we had enough of that horrible experience. Look, the Google display ads they're like big, they're giant calls to action. They're pulling people away from our platform. They're not very effective. People's eyes glaze over them, and they cause the site to load very slowly, which then causes us to ironically, because they're served by Google, rank lower in Google, we suspect. So it's like there's a whole bunch of good reasons for not serving those. We're still going to have ads in our forums, and we still do. They're just embedded in the feed, much more along the lines of a Facebook experience, for example, where you know you're getting ads in there, but typically those ads are reasonably relevant to you, and you're not like really annoyed by them. There's an art to, I think, correctly doing that in the online digital experience.
Yeah.
With the podcast, we just look at our competitor set and how they're doing it, and say, okay, great, we've got fewer ad time overall in our podcast than the competitor set. Why is that? Well, because we don't need the advertising revenue specifically. We certainly like to increase our profit margin on the advertising
Right.
and those types of things. But the goal of the podcast is not in and of itself, in comparison to some of our competition, to be the revenue driver. It
Right.
is one part of that community life cycle that I described earlier. And the goal primarily is to build that community and get to those points. However, we're not going to scale production on something that we're losing more and more money every time we produce. So
Right.
it's just being tight on those and those types of things. And then there's so many creative ways nowadays to potentially drive revenue, like I just described, by really getting smart about how we manage our advertising inventory, segmenting it so that we're serving, look, an advertiser might only lend in 12 states, 12 large states across the
Right.
country. They'd be willing to pay the same amount of money just to reach those 12 states and then give us back all the other inventory that's
Right.
going to the other, 37 states, 38, whatever I said earlier. And that's not like changing the user experience at all. That's improving the user experience and driving our ad revenue up, because now I get all those impressions back, can resell them, and those listeners in those 37 states are now getting something that's at least somewhat relevant to them, rather than this ad from a sponsor that can't possibly help them.
Yeah. Would you say having the advertising revenue as almost like as you said, ancillary source of revenue for the company helped kind of keep the vision clear in terms of what you want to do with the forums and the site versus it being a primary driver and a lot of people just completely destroying their ad density on their site?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think, advertising revenue for us it funds growth in
Mhm.
other areas of the business, right?
Right.
Um, Advertising revenue, when you zoom out and you look at like a media component of our business, one of my jobs as CEO is to grow the value of the business of BiggerPockets, right?
Yeah.
And advertising revenue, or, in some cases, is not valued as highly as a revenue stream in general
Mhm.
as, say, a subscription product or those types of things. So I actually am able to use a lot of our advertising revenue and those types of things to fund a product and engineering organization that is working on delivering really good, lasting subscription value, for example, to customers in various of these market niches and those types of things.
Yeah.
So is that answering your question? Am I going in the
That's
direction?
perfect answer. Yeah, exactly what I was looking for. And I think the publishers will appreciate that. And a good segue into what kind of advice you would give to, I think, publishers right now in the industry that have open available inventory, what they're trying to do. I think you have a unique take on advertising, right? There is display, there's video, there's a lot of different forms and fashion that digital advertising take, and you are, I think, have it pretty balanced between audio and native ads too, it sounds like, on the forums. So what kind of pieces of advice you'd give somebody that's trying to do something similar and make sure that the user experience is clean on their site?
Well, I think the first thing is, if you've been doing the same thing for the last 3 or more years in a row,
Yeah.
that's the first place to look, is to be like, all right, zero base it. Pretend you don't have any of your systems. How would you do it from scratch? Call up your advertisers and say, what would your dream sponsorship look like with us?
Right.
What would be the perfect thing that you want there, right? And go back from that. How's this for a travesty of a problem in our organization that we recently uncovered when we did this? we have this podcast for real estate investing.
Right.
Each week, that podcast generates like 200,000. Sorry, every new podcast typically generates well over 200,000 downloads in the
Right.
first 90 days following release. Okay. The way we structured our contracts forever was this. We said, hey, advertiser, we're going to tell you, you're going to get 200,000 downloads or more from this podcast, and we're going to charge you this fee. The problem was, 1 week out of the quarter, we'll have one that hits 198,000 downloads. And the way our contract is structured, we have to basically reserve the ad when that happens. And it's like, no. And everybody else is getting 50,000 bonus impressions because, over what they're paying for. So we did, and another problem with this is that the contract is only for the first 90 days. But the back catalog, 30 or 90 days, I'm missing it up. But anyways, we all of our old shows, users go back and listen to them in a binge format. So they'll just like crush hundreds of these old episodes. I know, because I used to do that for the show to get caught up. And so those are almost more valuable listeners to advertisers because they're really dedicated and listening to every single week rather than, whoever happened to listen to that first. They're probably all valuable.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So now I've just created, if you're following me, I got 200,000 weekly, 250,000 weekly back catalog downloads. So now I've got between 250 and 300,000 incremental advertising impressions that I haven't been selling because I've been doing it one way for so long and just been like, boxed in and looking at that. So it's like, I would say zero base it and say, how many total impressions am I going? What's the value of those? Oh, and I'm selling it at below market rates because our audience has these specific characteristics and those types of things. So it's really kind of getting clear about like, what is that? And then you think, okay, great. Now that I've got like on a national basis, how do I then get creative to drive more than that? Is there a way is LA worth, that I don't know, that making this up, the 10,000 listeners in LA, is that worth $5,000 to somebody to sponsor that?
Right.
Probably, right? To the right sponsor. Or is the right sponsor willing to go in there and say, maybe not pay me $5,000, but pay me $1,000 per customer acquired from that, right? And so those are all ways. And look, the way I think about it from there is, I've got this now theoretical max in inventory. Let's say it's $100,000 a week in inventory to sell, and maybe I'm selling 30-40% of that theoretical max. That's great. That means I've got a really fun game to play. I need to go out and hire some people and tell them, dude, just go and stack this up. And like, no, I don't expect you to sell $70,000 in inventory at full price next week. I expect you to just like go to the advertiser and say, hey, advertiser, I've got $70,000 in inventory to sell next week alone, and I'm never going to sell it.
Right.
The price would normally be $25 per thousand. Would you take it for $16 per thousand impression, right? I know, that's going to be way within your ROI threshold or whatever it is you need in order to justify the spend. I'm getting zero if I don't sell it. Take that. And then you just fill up the bucket. You're like, okay, my theoretical max is 100. I'm going to go from 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 to 80% fulfillment. And then once I start bumping up against 80% fulfillment, I need to really get concerned, because going from 80 to 100% fulfillment is really hard and stresses your relationships and forces you to be perfect. You make a mistake, which always happens, like the copy's not right, or the script was read wrong, or the ad aired after the sale for the sponsor ended, whatever it is. They don't come up that frequently in a good tight run organization, but they'll come up from time to time. It's much more fun to be, okay, instead of saying, how do I go from 80% fulfillment to 100% fulfillment? How do I go from $100,000 a week in potential inventory to $200,000 a week in inventory, and then be again at 30 or 40% fulfillment? That's the game that the leadership, I think, of the organization should be playing to create that extra inventory and give your advertising, your sales team, the fun problem of filling up a really inefficient bucket rather than the tough slog and filling other thing. Once you're there, systems and you usually run out, build out the systems and those types of things, but otherwise kind of create that inventory.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point too to address. You're talking about it for any kind of digital advertising, but the revenue targets, not just a CPM target, because as you said, you can have an extremely high CPM for some of this ad inventory, but at the end of the day, your fill rate is a lot lower, leaving a bunch of remnant inventory that you have to go and sell. So, so with that said, would you say that it might be worth, especially for a site, let's say like 1 million page views to 10 million page views a month, it would make a lot of sense to explore programmatic for some of that remnant? Or would you still say, depending on that site niche, to target direct sales, like you're saying, going straight for some of these advertisers?
Look at it as look at it as a bucket, right? And say, theoretically, I could sell out every zip code in the country and get a $500 CPM for that inventory.
Right.
That's completely impractical because I'm selling advertising in $12 increments in order to get to that $500 CPM, right? So just look at it from a practical, say like, what is my, there's these terms that you use in business like tangible addressable market. That's the potential, that's like the biggest possible way to address your market. Then there's like the serviceable addressable market. Then there's a serviceable obtainable market. Get rid of all that jargon. What do you think is like actually accessible for your organization? Not with your current team or the way you currently run ads, but in a theoretical capacity, right? What could you really be doing? And then it's not that hard. There's so many ways and programs and ways to begin selling this ad. DoubleClick, for example, allows you to create lots of different custom images and sizes and those types of things.
Right.
You can build an in-house advertising platform that allows you to place inventory. You can segment it by geography. Find cohorts of users that are big enough and meaningful enough that are going to be worth your time to sell. If it's 1,000 people, it's too small. If it's 10,000, you're probably close to the border on how big that on that. At 100,000, you're definitely worth carving out a reasonably sized cohort, probably,
Right.
depending on your organization. And then say, great, what is the reasonable thing here? And then everybody else dump them into programmatic or to a national sponsor who wants to buy it at a discounted rate or whatever.
Right.
But it's just filling up that bucket, I think, in general, the right way and appropriately. Make sure all these sponsors are right for your users and those types of things. You're not getting like, inappropriate ads or ads that don't make any sense for them.
Right. So essentially, take a look at your site. Take a good look at what's going on in your user base, what you have on the site in terms of content, and then kind of addressing your ad strategy to that, because everybody's going to be a little different. Where somebody might be 60% direct sold inventory versus programmatic, whereas some other sports sites might be 60% programmatic and the 40% being direct sold.
Yeah, like if you're on a sports site, I imagine DraftKings is going to want to buy all your inventory,
Right.
right? So it's like that. Then it's easy. Then you just like you say, great, I'm going to contract this agency or whatever. I'm going to manage the relationship with DraftKings directly, and that's it. There's no point in hiring out a big, complicated sales organization.
Yeah.
But for us, given that we have communities of flippers, communities of wholesalers, communities of accredited investors, and those types of things, I think it makes a little more sense to begin segmenting our audience more in deeper ways and matchmaking them with advertisers one by one. We've got investors in local DMAs who need agents, right?
Yeah.
How do you do a national campaign for a real estate agent? You can't do it.
Right. That's awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Scott, so for our audience today, what's going to be the easiest way for our users, our publishers that are listening today to get connected with you and BiggerPockets?
Sure. You can just email me at scott@biggerpockets.com. That's the
Okay.
easiest way to go about it. And always looking to swap ideas. I do not have all the answers for this. We're still figuring it out. I just told you how ridiculously inefficient, some of the ridiculous inefficiencies we found in our organization. So please shoot me some ideas and those types of things. And look, if you can help us fill up our bucket faster and more appropriately, I am all ears. So.
Yeah, 100%. And then I can't leave this out, but I know you're an author and have wrote Set for Life. Anywhere that they can find that as well, or is that going to be BiggerPockets?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we can definitely plug my book. Feel free to I owe you a couple beers now. But yeah, no, my book is called Set for Life. It's written for really kind of like people in their 20s and maybe early 30s that are looking to kind of move toward financial freedom from a standing start with little to no assets. And so it's kind of like, how do you save up that first 25,000? How do you buy that first investment or find that next job that allows you to have that commission-based potential or those types of things that will help you scale your income? And you can buy that anywhere books are sold, including Amazon or on BiggerPockets or at Barnes & Noble and many of those indie book retailers as well.
Cool. Couple different options. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I hope everyone has a great Friday and the rest of your weekend. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. And Scott, thanks for jumping on.
Thank you, Josh.